Here we go. Hi, everybody. This is Kathy L. Murphy, the Pulpwood Queen, reporting live from Murphy's Law in East Texas. And today we have a panel that's going to be great. We have my wonderful friend and literary agent, Marly Rusoff of Marly Rusoff Associates in New York, is going to be in conversation with Pulpwood Queen author Claire Fullerton. So welcome, welcome, everybody. Thank you. Is Claire on?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yay. Okay, we can move Claire and Marly to the top of the page. Claire's facing some Santa Ana winds out in Malibu, California. So we are in New York and Malibu. Take it over, Claire.
Marly, so
Hi.
great to see you. I'm going to just do one thing here.
Okay.
There you are. I can see you now. What a pleasure to have you here live and in person. Thank you so much for coming to the Pulpwood Queen Zoomathon, gracing us with your presence.
Well, I'm very happy to be here. I had to put the crown on because I know that they're mandatory, but can I take it off now?
Yes.
Yes, ma'am, you may. Make yourself comfortable.
Okay. Well, I'm very happy to be here. Very happy to join you today.
Very good. Well, you are a literary agent of wide repute and renown, and we are all just so excited to have you here. And I understand we have close to 90 minutes, so this is great. And, I want to know really about your background, about, where are you from? Where do you live now? And, this type of thing. So let's start with that.
Okay. Well, you're speaking to me from my home office in New York. I'm originally from Minneapolis. I live in New York, and we have a second home now in Beaufort, South Carolina, which we felt was necessary when we started with Cassandra and others, the Pat Conroy Literary Center. We were going down so often that we wanted to have a place to stay, a place to keep my books, and just a place of our own. So I'm now living in two cities and sheltered in both, so that I really don't get out a whole lot, but I enjoy talking to my writers, and I'm on the phone all the time. Don't Zoom all that often, but I'm happy to do it today. And I would do anything for Kathy because I'm a former bookseller. So if we go back to the beginning, I can go back a little farther than that even, because my father was a bookbinder. He bound old and rare and library and all kinds of books. And so I grew up in a world of books. He was a book collector, but he also, it's kind of a magical world in some ways, because he would take off every once in a while from the bindery in his Buick with a big pot of horsehoof glue and gold foil and tools, and go to county courthouses to repair old county records. And those records contained the births, the deaths, the land transactions, all the essential things that bind a community together. And so when he would go, I would say, "Why do you have to go?" And he'd say, "Well, there are some books that are too valuable to ever be moved to the bindery. I have to go to them." So it was almost as though he was a doctor. He was going to fix those books that were so important. So the value I placed on books was enormous. I had my little golden book when I was 5, and I can't remember which it was, but it was maybe Cinderella or something, a classic, and it was falling apart. So I took it to my dad and I said, "Can you fix this for me?" And he said, "Yes." And I said, "Well, if I went to the bindery and wanted you to fix this book, how much would it cost to fix it?" And so he told, this 5-year-old $10. And I said, "Wow, $10. I think the book only cost a quarter." It didn't make any sense. And he said, "But Marly, you have to understand, when I bind a book, it will last for 100 years. And I thought, wow, that's really important. Books are that important, And so I had this elevated notion, and I was always, when I went to the university, I took a job at a bookstore part-time, and nothing I studied. I kept changing my majors. I just couldn't figure it out. I was at the University of Minnesota, and all I loved was being in the bookstore. So when an empty space came open on the other side of the Mississippi, the bookstore I worked in was on the West Bank, and the East Bank had a small opening. The East Bank was the historic part. It was where Bob Dylan came to sing at the Midnight Scholar when he was just starting out. And there was a music shop that was run by a man who married a French woman who was a chanteuse, and they ran the music shop near my bookstore. So I rented a space and I opened up my own store. And that was sort of the beginning of my commitment, saying that of all the worlds available to me, the largest, most exciting world possible is the world of books, because it includes everything, and having a small store, I had very little money. I started out, $3,000 and very little money and credit from a wonderful, kind book wholesaler. But it was a way of extending my own education while I was meeting people and serving customers. My store became a hangout for writers and poets. And we just began doing things that weren't done at the time. We're talking about 40 years ago. So, we were doing literary events, we were doing lots of stuff, but I just was making up things as I went along. And when I had an upstairs apartment come available, I decided that I wanted to rent it and move some of the small press books and get a couch and chairs and have a coffee pot and have a more comfortable place for hanging out. So I was making no money. I was making $50 a week running all this huge enterprise. But pretty soon my friends were coming back from MFA programs and they were broke. Writers and memoirists, Patricia Hampel, Jim Moore were two of them. And so I said, if you want to take a few students, they were doing some, consulting or, taking on a few things. So I said, I'll give you the keys to the bookstore at night upstairs, and you can use it to conduct your workshops. And so the upstairs of my bookstore had a nightlife of its own. And so the keys would move back and forth, and people would take 6 students and they would charge them $10. And so they would help pay the rent. And so I was running something more than a bookstore. And when it came time that I realized I could no longer afford to keep both things going, I called all my writer friends together and I said, I don't feel this is mine to close. This belongs to all of us. How would you feel about forming a collective, a kind of a guild of writers? And we'll call it the Loft, because it was already the book loft. And we'll support each other. We'll celebrate each other's successes. We'll have a community based on our passion for reading. And everyone agreed. We had a huge fundraiser in the basement of an Italian restaurant, and Garrison Keillor was just starting out in radio. He was the MC. We had a band there. I mean, it was a fabulous night. And I sold 200 memberships to something called the Loft, which is now one of the largest literary centers in America. But we sold them. And I remember when I was asked what the Loft was, I said, I'm really not sure, but we're going to find out soon, And that's how we started. So I ended up taking a job for a publisher when I went through a change in my life. I needed to do something else. After 10 years, I was offered a job as a sales rep. I'd never had a new car. In fact, I'd never even, had a charge, my own MasterCard, it was like, so I suddenly was offered a territory and I took it. I thought, I sold my bookstore to an employee for $1. The Loft had moved to a bigger space, and I got in my big old Oldsmobile and I started driving. And in fact, probably some of the same states my father had traveled to when he was repairing county records. So for a year and a half, I look at it as missionary work. I traveled North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, Wisconsin, and Iowa. I went to places that it's hard to imagine that another rep would have gone there, to be honest. But I did. I went and I talked to booksellers, and I got to see the world of readers. And there wasn't anything like my hippie bookstore. It was another world altogether. But it was probably some of the best training I could have had for the rest of my career, both in publishing and as a literary agent. So that's the trajectory. I was given the job. I'd met Pat Conroy in my bookstore.
I was going to ask you about
Yeah.
Pat.
So I have to
I know you have some good Pat stories.
Yeah. So Pat came, his sister, who became Savannah in The Prince of Tides, his sister Carol is a wonderful poet, and she was a friend of mine. And she brought her brother Pat in right around the time The Great Santini was published. So Pat came in, and I had a whole like 12-foot wall of poetry. That's why I never made any money, but I had ordered every poet in America was in my store, and from other countries as well. So Pat ended up with a whole armload of poetry books. And he had his girls with him, and all my little coterie of writer friends would rent these tar paper shacks on Lake Superior up near Duluth and Superior, and go there for the summer. I couldn't leave the bookstore except for weekends, but they were there writing and sitting on the rocks, and it's a gorgeous place. People who don't know Lake Superior and that rocky shore, are missing something. So Pat, that's how I met Pat. And when I ended up leaving the bookstore and was offered a job at Houghton Mifflin to run the publicity department out of New York, and I had no experience running a publicity except the events I did in my store. So I moved to New York, and I was probably there for just a month or two when Nan Talese walked into my office with this huge manuscript and said, "Marly, I have a novel here, and the author says he knows you." And Jonathan Galassi had been his editor. He left, and Nan was taking over. And I said, "Well, who is it?" And she said, "It's Pat Conroy." And she handed me The Prince of Tides. And so I worked with Pat basically as either the marketing and publicity, and then later as an agent for all of his books from The Prince of Tides on. And that's how I met him. But my favorite story about Pat is when he came to New York. I had recently been married to my husband, who was from Romania. And we were just, starting out, didn't have a lot of money. And he came into the office one day and said, and he would call me Rusoff. He'd say, "Rusoff, what's going on?" So I said, "Well, Conroy, we're trying to buy a house in Westchester because I got to get out of the city. There's not enough room here." And so in a typical Pat fashion, what I came to realize was typical Pat. He said, "Well, it's expensive, you're not in Minnesota anymore, Marly, it costs a lot of money to buy a house." He said, "How are you going to swing it?" And I said, "Well, we'll figure out a way." And he said, "Well, let me help you." And I said, "What are you talking about?" And he said, "This book that you've been working on so hard, Prince of Tides, is doing really well. And now they're interested in other countries." And he said, "Pick a country. I'll give you the rights to that country." And he said, "I've already given away Italy, but maybe you'd like Spain or Germany, or, I'll give you a country." And so I said, "Pat, I can't do that." But I never forgot it, because he really meant it. If I would have picked a country, he would have had the paperwork drawn up. He was that generous. So it was, in a sense, that generosity of Pat's that I saw replicated again and again and again. And so when Pat died, this is a nice segue from Cassandra. We were in Beaufort for the funeral, my husband, Mihai, and myself. And the mayor was talking about putting up a statue of Pat. And we looked at each other and we thought, well, Pat would hate that. And so because I had started the loft in Minneapolis, and that's where I met Pat, I called the mayor and I said, "We need a literary center in Beaufort in his honor. That's give a tribute to Pat Conroy." And so that was the beginning of the Pat Conroy Center, and a lot of work for a lot of people. And after a week or two, I called Cassandra and said, "Do I have your permission? Will you be a part of this?" And I knew she was too devastated to really play an active part in it. But so that's how it started. And then eventually, after a year, we raised enough money to hire Jonathan Haupt and begin expanding the programs. And now we're in the process of buying our own home, a building that will be a permanent home for the Pat Conroy Center in the historic downtown that Pat loves so much.
Have you in fact bought the building?
Yes, well, we don't own it yet because we own the mortgage, but we did sign papers last week, and we couldn't be more excited.
Congratulations.
it's a wonderful place. And I want all of you out there to come to Beaufort and visit the Pat Conroy Center and see what will be growing out of that.
We'd love to hear about the location of it in Beaufort. Does it have a river view?
Well, we have a river view of a block. There's an empty lot in front of us, and there's a distant river view of the Beaufort River. And we have parking, but it's walking distance throughout the historic area. It's a block off of Bay Street. And the prettiest walk in all of Beaufort is right there. You walk past a lot of historic old homes, that have really fantastic sort of local historical interest.
Yes. They're breathtaking. The architecture in Beaufort is just absolutely captivating. Such a part of the ambiance of the entire city. So have you found that the locals in Beaufort have gotten behind supporting the Pat Conroy Literary Center? We all love Jonathan Howe.
Yes.
Love him. And he's such an engaging, charismatic character. You have quite a leader at the helm there. So I want to hear about that and how much day-to-day involvement, perhaps week-to-week involvement you have with the Pat Conroy Literary Center.
Well, it's interesting. My partner and my husband, Mihai, we have, when Pat died, it was left to us to announce it he manages Pat's Facebook page and the website. The Facebook page was owned by Doubleday, but we still run it. And so we are in constant contact with Pat's readers. We've never stopped. Over the years, when a new book came out, we knew it was fans where we were in contact with. They would write, and we've kept that alive. So Pat, Jonathan runs the day-to-day of the center, but in terms of the, being a part on the board, forming a board and the vision, and maintaining the contact with his readers and running the web presence, that's pretty much in our agency's office as volunteers. We just continue to keep the legacy of Pat as alive as we possibly can.
Can you tell us about the inside for those of us that hasn't seen the Pat Conroy Literary Center? I understand his desk is there.
Oh, it's so wonderful. You just, what's amazing is that you walk in, now it'll be placed near the windows that overlook the bay. I would say a large percentage of the people who come to the center walk in, look at his desk, and they see his yellow legal pad with some of his writing, and they see his dad's flight jacket hanging over a chair, and they see some of the parts of Pat's writing life, and they burst into tears. And a lot of them will want to sit in his desk, which we allow. There's no ropes in our museum. People climb onto his desk and they sit down, and their friends take their pictures, and I'm sure they end up on Facebook pages everywhere. But a lot of them just sit and cry and that was the gift. And this is what I think, if I'm talking to writers today, writers can make a tremendous difference. And Pat, by opening up his wounds and sharing the way he did and the courage, he went to the Citadel to become a warrior, and he became a warrior. He fought a lot of battles, but they were literary battles. He told the truth, and he paid a price for it in family and various ways over time. It's all together now, but there were ups and downs. But what he did was, we had a letter that I'll mention from a guy who, many letters actually, but this one moved me particularly. Many letters from people who say that Pat Conroy saved my life. They didn't just say, oh, I love his novels, or, what great characters. And they would say he saved my life. And that's what happens when truth hits the page and when a writer is willing to be vulnerable. People out there need to know they're not alone. And authors really can play a tremendous role in making that happen. And so Pat's legacy is not just of his books, but it's of his courage and his generosity. And that's sort of what the center has to represent. there was one day I was standing on the porch with his sister, Kathy, and an African-American man walked up on the porch and was looking around, and we approached him and said, how are you? And so happy you're here. Did you happen to know Pat? Because a lot of people in the beginning were people who knew him. And he told me, he said, yes, he did. And then he told us a story. This is the tell me a story part of our lives. I mean, the stories are incredible. So he said when they went to high school, they were segregated high schools, but they were both athletes. So they knew each other through sports. And Pat was basketball. This guy was football, I think. But anyway, he knew Pat. And when Pat went off to the Citadel reluctantly after his dad insisted, this fellow said that he ran into Pat and Pat invited him to come to Charleston. He said, if you're ever in Charleston, come and I'd like to show you the Citadel because it's really an amazing place. So he did. One day he calls Pat and says, I'm going to be in Charleston. And he walks around. Pat takes him into the dining hall. He takes him into the library, the place where the cadets did the formation, the whole tour. And then when he walked out to the corner of the street and his friend was about to leave, he said, I feel I ought to tell you something. And he said, you and I just broke the law. And he looked at him and he said, what are you talking about? And he said, there's a law in the books in South Carolina that no Black person can come within 2 blocks of the Citadel. And I wanted to break that law. And it's helped me do that today. Thank you for coming. So he was this social justice. It was in his bones. He hated anything that was unfair. He hated bullies, and we as a country, and we need to be more like Pat. We need to be more courageous. We need to listen to other people's stories. And the other thing about Pat, when we talk about what a good storyteller he was, it always makes me want to say, yes, that was wonderful. But he was the most eloquent listener that I've ever encountered. That people would tell Pat their stories and he would listen and he would remember. And when I traveled with him on book tours, as I often did, to meet his fans, people would come up and he would say, hi, how are you doing? My name is Pat Conroy, shake hands and ask them where they were from. And if they would mention they knew someone who knew someone, he always was incredibly gracious. But he also, if someone came a second time, even if it took him 7 or 8 years to write a novel, even if it was 8 years later, he would remember them.
And so you represented Pat as, you were his literary agent, but at first you were his publicist. Is that correct?
I was the head of publicity and marketing at Houghton Mifflin. And then I moved over with Nan to Doubleday. And I continued with him, with Pat and Margaret Atwood. And those were the books that I'd worked on with Nan at Doubleday. And so publishing was very good to me in many ways. But when I learned quickly that the better you are, the more likely they are to promote you. And the more you get promoted, the less contact you have with writers. So,
that's interesting. I would love for you to speak more to that, because certainly there is a difference in being a publicist and being a literary agent. I know you represent other luminaries, Cassandra King, of course, Ron Rash.
Yeah, yes.
You mentioned Margaret Atwood. And what type of personal fulfillment do you get from representing some of these luminaries? And what's your involvement?
Well, what's fun? The fun part for me is when they're not luminaries. Like Ron Rash had only been published by the Mecklenburg County Library. A novel called One Foot in Eden, and I bought it when I was in a bookstore in North Carolina. It was one of the ugliest books I'd ever seen, but I asked the bookseller. I always trust booksellers. I said, "What do you think? What should I read? What's good? Give me something by a local writer." And I ended up with, as Pat left my store with Armload, I always left I wanted to support independent bookstores. So I left with an armload of books, and One Foot in Eden was one of them. So I read One Foot in Eden on the plane, and I thought, my God, this guy is incredible. So when I got back to New York, I called the bookseller and I said, who is this guy? And they told me he worked at a community college. And so I tracked him down, and I said, I don't want to interfere with if you have a relationship with an agent, or, but I just want to tell you how much I enjoyed your novel. And I rarely do this. And I said, but if you ever decide you want to consider having a representation, and I just want you to know, I think you're wonderful. So he said he'd been trying for years to get an agent, and he hadn't been able to. And he was working on a novel. And so we started working together. And during the time we worked together, I got him in the New Yorker, the Atlantic, 5 or 6 books, and saw him go from, in fact, Pat loved to tease him, and he would say, well, here comes Mr. Big, and I'm Mr. Small, this brown rash or something. So that's the fun part. And, even for Pat, his Prince of Tides was his first bestseller. Margaret Atwood, The Handmaid's Tale, that was her first bestseller. She had 6 books before that had sold modestly, and so to take a writer from, wherever they are and give them readers. And I guess that's partly coming from being a bookseller too. You want to just grab people by the collar and say, you have to read this book. And booksellers play, a big role in the ecology of the writer's life. And I hope that this COVID thing will be behind us, this mayhem, and that people will be wandering into bookstores again, because there is no replacement for that.
Agreed. And so that leads me to wonder about your role as an agent. Can you tell us what you look for in taking on a new client? And do you look towards fostering their career, long range?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because I'm intentionally small as an agency. I brought an agent in once, and I found that I had to read my stuff and her stuff. And one day, I was asking her, she had been an editor in a publishing house. And I said, do you like being an agent? I couldn't tell. She wasn't that enthusiastic. And then she said, well, I like everything except the money part. I'm not good at talking about money. So I said, well, writers aren't good at talking about money. That's part of the job. You've got to, learn how to talk about money. And so she ended up not being an agent anymore. But I decided I would not take on more, or try not to take on more than I could handle, and not have that experience that I had before of getting bigger and bigger. And suddenly I'm doing budgets and doing, I had 17 people at one point. I think it was maybe 15 or 17, doing performance reviews, budgets, and getting called into budget meetings. I hated it, And so I decided that for this part of my life, the agency started in 2001, that I would try to keep it small and intimate, and help writers achieve what was in them and tell the stories that they had to tell. But it's, in essence, it's made me have to be very careful. So what I look for, I want to be surprised. I really want to, everybody does. We're all so jaded. There's so many things have been told in so many different ways. If someone cares, if someone has a distinctive voice, there are people like, I've worked with some of the great ones. So if you pick up a page of Margaret Atwood, I go, oh, hi, Peggy, how are you? You're back in Margaret Atwood land. You pick up a page of Conroy and it's Conroy. And I was lucky enough to work with Tim O'Brien, who I think is a genius too. But those are distinctive voices. And I really like that, it's hard to find. It's very hard to find. And I like, stories that haven't been told before. One of my clients now, and I'm not sure how many books we'll do together, but we certainly got this one out and probably additional ones, because she doesn't write in English. It's Homera Koderi, and the book is dancing in the mosque. And it was picked by People magazine as a book of the week 3 weeks ago, I guess. And it's the story of a mother in Afghanistan who actually had been featured in another novel that a lot of book clubs read about the sewing circles of Herat. She was 14, 15 years old, and she was secretly teaching other girls to read. And so they formed a writing club, but they had to call it a sewing circle because the Taliban was always close at hand, right?
Right.
So that came out. So that's a voice that, we need to hear and know more about, But
Indeed. Jonathan Odell, and he's from Minnesota. Isn't it? I'd like to hear a little of that story. I did read Miss Hazel in the Rosa Parks League,
yeah,
and I understand that was with a small press prior to you crossing paths with Mr. Odell, and then it became something else at the turn of your hand. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because I think that what that speaks into, and for many authors, there seems to be a little bit of a mystery. If you have 2 or 3 or 4 books out and they're with a small press, is it possible to land somewhere and go wider? So if you want to tell the Jonathan Odell story about a particular book.
Yeah, well, what I would say to writers, there is hope. There's Jonathan Odell was unlucky, and he was lucky in that his agents sold a book, The View from Delphi, to McAdams and Cage. He was unlucky in that they published it. They were a small press, and his book was scheduled to be published a month after The Time Traveler's Wife. And what happened with The Time Traveler's Wife is that the success completely swamped this small press, and his book went out unedited, really. And the jacket was designed by a secretary. It was horrible. Everything that could go wrong with his experiences went wrong. And I didn't really follow. I hadn't read his writing sentence by sentence is gorgeous. So it's not a bad book. It's just a bloated book without any attention paid. And so he came to me I was at one of the annual Loft events I would go back to Minnesota for, and he was living in Minnesota. He said he moved from Mississippi, from where he lived in the Delta, to the sane side of the Mississippi River, to Minneapolis, is what he said. And he was writing about the South. And what I read the manuscript, and that manuscript became The Healing, which Nan Talese published, and which is one of my favorite novels of all time. And every book club ought to read The Healing too. So after I read The Healing, I thought, this guy is amazing. I should go back and look at View from Delphi. So I started it, and I said, well, Jonathan, there's a story here. What happened to this book? Because it's good, but it was as though nothing happened. And so he explained to me. And then in a moment of crazy bravado, I guess, I said, well, why don't I just republish it? I'll set up a publishing imprint. I want to know more about what it's like to publish today. So there was a street in St. Paul, a little alley off of Summit Avenue called Maiden Lane. And so I had already been thinking about this for a while. So I decided to start a press, and we took the book and re-edited it and retitled it and relaunched it and sent him on a tour. And he probably, we probably sold 15,000 books. And he was able to have the satisfaction. Miss Hazel was based on his mother, who was an alcoholic. And I had taken Jonathan and Pat Conroy together to do a panel in Decatur. And I seem to be diverting, but it's an interesting diversion, I hope. Jonathan's mother, when The View from Delphi came out, he wrote it with a certain amount, the first novel, with a certain amount of anger towards his childhood, the suffering he'd gone as a child of an alcoholic and a father who was a little bit distant. And he was gay. He was maybe not quite sure who he was, but it was a difficult childhood. So when he wrote the original View from Delphi, he had, the View from Delphi, he had the mother as a roaring alcoholic, and the little boy was named Johnny, which was what they used to call him. So he lived in terror that when the book came out, his mother would be so devastated, and he didn't really want to hurt her, but he really needed to tell the truth. So when the book came out, he sent a galley to his mother to read beforehand so she'd be prepared. And so this is a story he told that Pat loved. So he calls his mom and says, "Hey mom, how you doing?" And she says, oh Johnny, your book is so sad. Oh my God, that poor little boy." She said, "I felt so sorry for that poor little boy. And I kept thinking, if only I had been his mother." So she completely missed that it was her. And he thought, my God, the denial that one can save oneself from the pain. And that's exactly what happened. But anyway, so it became Miss Hazel in the Rosa Parks League. And he was invited by the mayor of Atlanta to speak to a book club made up of his entire staff. And a lot of good things happened. But in any case, that's the story. But what the lesson for writers, and I want to go to a lesson because I don't want to just bloviate,
You're not bloviating, you're fascinating.
Well, the lesson here is, and there's a good one, that it's not over. Look at the bestseller list right now. I mean, it's crazy. Books that, especially under COVID, books that were published a long time ago are suddenly becoming bestsellers again. That's really interesting to me. The reason it's happening, though, of course, is what's making it so hard for debut writers. This year has been a terrible, in some ways, a devastating year for a new writer to come out. And I feel sorry for every debut novelist that was published in 2020 because people were looking for security. They were looking for familiar names. They were looking for classics. They weren't, it's like they were taking too many chances just walking out the door. So they're not going to take another chance on a writer.
That's a very, very good point. Keep talking.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what was going on. People were not, they were looking for something to be comforting and secure. And it was interesting to me that World War II, I sold May Clayton's wonderful novel, and it came out luckily in 2019, called The Last Train to London, about the Kinder transport. But she was one of many sort of World War II novels that came out that have been really warmly embraced. And I was telling someone the other day that I think the reason is that it's the last time where we thought we knew who the bad guys were.
Right.
Back to these were the bad guys. And no one knows right now who the bad guys are. And we don't even know if we're the bad guys. So it's people are seeking comfort and familiarity and just, something else. But I noticed in the book review this week, there was an essayist, I can't remember his name, but the whole book review was about how miserable he'd been in his experience with his editor and how he had then taken the book back. He saved up enough money. He didn't make any money on it. It was a collection of essays, but he said he had to pay 5 times what he was paid to do it and go through 2 or 3 years of suffering with his editor. He bought it back and then added a few more essays, and his agent, or I don't know, but his agent probably resold it to Scribner's, and now it's getting lots of attention and rave reviews. So, and I just helped another author buy rights back from a national mainstream publisher. And there was a book I did actually that I love, and your book groups would love it too if you don't know about it. It's a book called Dog Medicine, and it's a memoir of a young woman who was in publishing and had a nervous breakdown. I can understand why. And
who was the author?
Barton. And let me see. I'll think of it before we.
Okay. Very good.
It's Barton. Her last name is Barton, and it was about probably 7 years ago, and it was published by Think Peace Press, a tiny little publishing house. And the book was, one of my authors read it and said, "This is so good. It should have been with a major press." And then she talked to the author, and the author had never had an agent and didn't go to a major press. And so Julie, is her name. Julie ended up with a local publisher who was enthusiastic and had no distribution. So she asked if I wanted to take it on. So this is something that an agent can do, but it's not much fun. And that's when you go to someone who thinks that they love the book and everything else and say, "Are you interested in passing the rights back to the author? And if so, what would that cost?" Because she would like to get bigger distribution. And so that's what happened. And I sold it to Catherine Court at Viking. And, she went from selling, a couple thousand copies to 50,000 copies. And now she's working on another memoir.
Which tells us distribution is key.
Yeah, so distribution. Now, but things have changed so much in the favor of writers. I mean, and the good news is because of the internet, there's another one author I had, and he had been published by major houses, had one like a celebrity editor at Simon & Schuster for his first 2 books. Sales weren't great, but they were good reviews. And then he moved to another wonderful editor, and the sales were terrible. And when he came to me, through one of my clients, she said, "Can you help my friend who's in trouble?" And so at that point, I must have had enough time on my hands to be able to say, "Oh, I'll talk to him." But anyway, what I did was I said, "I'll read a few pages." And so I started to read it, and it was unlike anything I'd read. The book actually was Thomas Christopher Green's The Headmaster's Wife.
Okay.
And I was really compelled by the story. It opens up and you don't know, it's an unreliable narrator, it turns out, but there's a man wandering in Central Park that gets taken into the police station, and he's naked, and they arrest him, and he's confused, and he thinks he murdered someone. And they start asking him questions. So the book, it goes back, and it turns out he was a headmaster at a school who had lost his mind, sort of. And you don't know exactly what happened until the end of the book. So I told him I'd take it on, and everybody turned it down because they looked at the numbers. The numbers were terrible. Until I had lunch with an editor at St. Martin's, Thomas Dunn, and said, "I really want you to read this. I think it's remarkable. Will you read it?" He did, and he offered it, but he said, "I can't give you very much money because of his track. The sales force, will have a hard time selling it." So I said, "Great. We need a new start. So let's do it." So we did the contract, and he ended up, it was very difficult for the sales force to get the book out. They probably got 3,000 copies into the stores, which could be, which was disappointing. But the reviews started coming in, and all of a sudden, Amazon went from being the devil to the salvation in this case, because over time he sold 70,000 ebooks. So that novel was saved by the fact that, no one could get the book anywhere because it wasn't in the stores. But because of the ebooks, largely on Amazon, but other places as well, he sold a ton of books. And then it was possible for me to bring him back into the game. So that's how that happens. So it can happen.
Yeah, I love the editor, mentioning of the editor. You're so well versed now with your track record and your longevity as an agent. And when you have a manuscript, do you easily arrive at an editor that you want to take that manuscript to? And are your relationships such that you know
Yeah.
who would like what?
That's actually, one of the things that there are a lot of young editors now that I don't have that kind of relationship with, but I do have a relationships with a lot of them. And what it makes a difference if they trust you. they'll read it because they know that they trust my taste, or they know that in most cases, they know that they can count on me. As a lot of agents sell the book and they disappear, and publishers don't like that. They like to have someone to call and say the author is driving the publicist crazy and she thinks that she needs to have X, Y, and Z, and we think it's unreasonable. The authors don't want to be fighting with their publishers, and so you become a mediator. You talk to the author, you find out, you call back and say, my author is right about this, this, and this, and your person is wrong on that, but she's right on this, and you become a mediator, and you make things work. So that's part of the role of an agent. And
can you speak to how much you work, in publicity, in promotion for a book as an agent?
I don't anymore. With Ron, it was kind of crazy, because when I got the book being published by a library, I called the library when I took on his new novel, because it was just, the book had been published, say, in September, and I took him on in October, and I was going to try to go out with paperback rights to the publisher. Ron didn't control the rights to his own novel because of the contract he signed with the library. So I was representing the library for his first novel to license a paperback, and I was representing Ron on his new novel. So it was complicated, but there were no reviews. So I asked the publisher to send me the reviews. They had one review, and it was in a Creative Loafing in, Charlotte, North Carolina or something. And so I thought, well, this is not helpful. And so at that time, and we're talking, 12 years ago or something, at that time, I still had contacts, which I don't have anymore, at the LA Times and various places. So I was able to be a publicist and get him a review in the LA Times and in the Atlanta Journal, and someone at NPR read it and loved it, and it made the NPR's best. 2 months after I signed him, he was on the NPR Best of the Year list for One Foot in Eden, his debut.
I love that book.
So that was great. That was great. But I can't do that anymore, because the world has changed so much that there are no one or two things that can really make a difference. It used to be, it was, New York Times, my NPR, even Fresh Air. One of my authors was on Fresh Air, and I was so excited. And she was great, but it didn't have the same impact it used to. So a lot of what's going on now, and that's why these sort of groups, collaborative groups of writers, like certainly the Tall Poppies and Pulpwood Queens, and having a posse. What works now is having a posse of people who will go out and utilize their social media, who will help with the launch of your book and get the word out, because the world is so much more fractured. It's just there needs to be many people involved. The other thing that's changed, and I really think that this is important for writers to keep in mind, is it used to be that an author, when I was working at Houghton or Doubleday, the author didn't have to do all that much. The publisher did a lot of the stuff, and the author kind of waited to see if maybe they would get a tour, maybe it would be a week, whatever it was. But it wasn't a grueling ordeal the way it is today. So today, if you have a book that sells to a publisher, that's just the very beginning of what is required of you. And the authors who were in the game before are at a big disadvantage if they don't realize that the rules of the game have changed completely, and that you have to begin 6 months ahead. You've got to come up with a launch plan with your publisher. There are many parts of it that you're responsible for. In addition to everyone's responsible to get the blurbs from other writers. It's the author, the editor, and the agent. Everybody works for that, But a lot of my clients, the ones who succeed, hire outside publicity people. They work with outside marketing people.
That was my question about outside.
There's a whole team. If your goal is to be a best-selling author and to make a lot of money, you have to look at this as an enterprise, and you're the CEO of this enterprise, and each book is its own enterprise, but you have to really get involved and roll up your sleeves and work. To me, if you don't enjoy the journey, if writing isn't something you have to do, and that fulfills a part of you that nothing else can fulfill, I can't tell people to write books to make money, because I can't, it's not happen. It doesn't happen for most people. And even now with self-publishing can be expensive. Even these hybrid publishers, some of them are good, but some of them probably aren't. And I'm beginning to, and again, is Amazon has, or Ingram Sparks. Yeah, has a publishing program for self-publishing that I think is probably one of the best ways to go, because you're not going to get ripped off. If you want to do, say you just decide you want to do an ebook, or you want to do a print on demand book and an ebook, you can do that for not a lot of money, but maybe a couple $1,000s, I would guess. Some of the hybrid presses want $10,000 from you, and that's a problem, because you're pretty much going to be responsible for doing a lot of the marketing yourself. You'll have a little bit of support, but not a lot. So I'm beginning to see that it takes a very, very special author. One of them is Joe Palmer, who's maybe even on today, but his book, The Mariner's Tale, was with a hybrid press, and he is an amazing promoter. So he's going to do really well, and that'll set up him. He'll be set up for an agent and another house for his next book, because the novel is just that good. And the other novel that I directed to Kohler Books, which was a hybrid, was Rebecca Bruff's book, Trouble the Water, which is an incredible novel about an enslaved man who at 20 stole a ship during the
Robert Smalls.
Robert Smalls.
Yeah.
And she wrote the book because it was her passion. She didn't write the book because I think it's going to make me rich and I want to have a big career. And, she wrote the book because this was a story she had to tell. I took it around for her to a number of publishers, and they said, this isn't your story to tell. You're a white woman, 65-year-old white woman, kind of, this isn't yours. We'll wait for a Black person to come in and tell the story of this hero.
And did that surprise you, Marly?
Well, it's a change. It's one of the changes in our business,
Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I mean, it's very complex, because honestly, there has to be more room at the table for other voices. And there's a correction going on that's really important. And publishers are sending out, questionnaires to their authors, asking them, for their racial identity, their sexual, whatever it is, because they are under pressure to show that they are inclusive. And so when it comes to hiring and everything, there's like everything is under a microscope now. So, but this book was good enough and important enough. So I said, try the hybrid route. And she did. And it's changed her life in a wonderful way, because she's a wonderful speaker. She's doing book clubs everywhere. She's selling lots of copies. She keeps much bigger, higher percentage of the royalties for each book sold. The books are always delivered. They made a beautiful looking book for her. They helped with some editing. So she's happy. But I think the expectations that you have as a writer need to be factored in. And I guess my heart is with the writers who write because they have to, and I'll do what I can to help them make it something that can sell. But sometimes you just can't, sometimes I'll meet a writer who has great ideas, but they don't have control of the skills yet, but they might get there. Sometimes I have a writer who's at the sentence level is wonderful, but they don't have a sense of story, and so there's always, you're looking for, as an agent, you're looking for someone who has both, who knows how to tell a story and who can write, and that's not that easy to find, because if you have if you got a great story, you can kind of fix it in multiple revisions and working with outside editorial or whatever it is. But if you've got a bad story, it's very hard to fix. So story is key. And that's one of the things that I love about what we're going to do at the Pat Conroy Center with this whole storytelling state project starting later this year, is that we're celebrating sort of the diversity of stories in South Carolina, and trying to do what we can as a nonprofit, work with people who have stories to tell and help them find audiences for them. So that's, and one of the things I look at what's going on in Washington, D.C. Gosh, I'm not keeping on topic, am I? But anyway, I look at
on topic. We just want to hear you talk.
Okay. So I look at what's going on in Washington, and because I've spent so much time thinking about what it means to be kind of, for South Carolina, at least, to be the storytelling state, and what it means to tell stories. And what I really believe with my whole heart is that the stories are sort of what bind us together. What I've learned from a psychologist who did a book on the teenage brain and on children is, that children who are in the second or third grade and can't tell you where their grandparents came from, who don't have family stories, are almost always destined not to do well in school and to have problems, because those stories that may seem insignificant on the outside are what form identities, and it helps people know who they are. And what stories can do is they can bind a family, they can bind a religion, they can bind a nation. And what we have now is a broken story that we don't know who we are as a country. And that's why it's spilling out into the streets, because we don't have an agreement on who we are as a country. And until we get our story right, I'm not quite sure what's going to happen.
Well, that's a very beautiful perspective, and I thank you profusely for sharing that. Well said, well articulated. Thank you for that. I think that we have, well, first of all, Rebecca Bright Dwight Bruff is a Pulpwood queen, and we all enjoyed Trouble the Water. And one of our favorite Pulpwood queen authors is Bryn McLean.
Oh, she's wonderful.
She famously tells a story about trying to go the traditional publishing route. And then she heard Marly Rusoff give a talk on the power of the independent press. And Bryn has credited you repeatedly with
so
really
nice.
enlightening her. So could you speak to us, please, about what you think the differences are, the pros and cons, advantages, disadvantages, the independent press versus traditionally published books?
Well, if really the money is with the big 4 or 5, I don't know how many there are now, but we're about to be 4, I think, but
Yeah.
big presses, right? But some of the independent presses, I noticed that Milkweed has something on the Times list. It's a book on environmental essays on the New York Times bestseller list, and hardbound, I think. So getting to know the smaller presses now, agents don't, in a sense, you don't start out I'm looking for a good small press book, because the advances are so small that the time you put in as an agent is pretty much not a nonprofit venture. So
Right.
We have a contracts person, and I've sold books where all of my commission will go to pay the contracts person to look over a small press contract or something, So, and you can work for 2 or 3 years on a project, but that's okay. As long as you have a few that work, you know, you can afford to do that. The small presses can give you more attention. When you look at some place like Grey Wolf, I mean, these are the ones I know from Minnesota, but they're Tin House. I mean, I think Tin House has got a great ear for story. I like what they do. And many of them don't require an agent. So I think that's fantastic because agents are gatekeepers, but they're often wrong. There's often wrong as they are right. And I feel so sorry for writers going to an agent because you might be just, you know, probably get 100 queries a week. And, you know, you just in the business of saying no so much of the time. And it's very disheartening. So what I think, part of what the benefit of the small press and, well, you know, like some of the university presses, we've sold a couple of books to Mercer, University of Minnesota, I'm trying to think, but you know, they exist, and it's very hard to sit at the table every day as a writer and do your work when all you're getting is rejection. And the big presses are rejecting a lot because everybody comes to them. It's been a great boon to the smaller presses and the independent presses because a lot of very fine writers are now going to the smaller presses. There are lists online, you know, of good small presses. I guess maybe I'll give Kathy a couple of lists of,
That'd be great.
and then if anyone wants it, but
and what do you think the big presses are looking for? I mean, is it your opinion that what the big presses are looking for comes and goes in trends? That's
right now they're looking for other voices, you know.
Right.
It's a very bad time to be a white male writer, you know. I mean, I just think it's harder right now, but they've had a pretty good time of it, so you know they can step aside for a while. There are a lot more diverse voices. They're looking for diverse voices.
And how long do you think trends, what has been your observation? How long a trend? I know ephemeral as the question is, how long does a trend last?
Well, this is not just a trend. This is a national nervous breakdown. So I've never seen anything like this before. So I can't say for sure. I think that the face of the industry is changing, and it's a good thing. There are a lot more people of color working in publishing. One of the hard things for an agent is that now decisions are not being made by an editor who falls in love with a manuscript and walks into, like when I started, walks into the publisher's office and say, this is really wonderful. It has a few problems, but I can fix it. And then the publisher says, well, how much do you think it'll cost? And he says, well, I think I could buy it for $25,000. That's great. Okay, go ahead and do it. Doesn't happen anymore. And that's hard for writers because what's happened now is that it's not one person. In some ways, it might seem like it makes it better, but it's not. Because what happens is you end up in a room full of people who are making the decision in a major house. And so somebody in marketing has a vote, somebody in sales has a vote, somebody, you know, it's good for business. It's a good business decision, but it's a very bad decision for creative people because some of the risk taking, I think any artist, well, not any artist, but most artists have to be willing to take risks. And that's what's exciting, you know, when you read something that's you haven't read before, or that's that pushes the envelope a bit, you know, maybe there's an unreliable narrator, and people will say unreliable narrators don't work. People have these tropes about, you know, well, you can't have a child die, you know, you can't do this, you can't do that. And they're pretty damaging in a sense to the ability to get books sold now, because you've got a committee, and selling to a committee is much more difficult in my mind, you know.
Yes.
So that's part of what's going on. And that because there's so many people that are, the reason that the freelance editors have so much work is that the editors now know that if they wait long enough, say they're committing, they, at least verbally, they want to publish fewer books and make them bigger. which is a great business decision, right? So what that means, though, is that the editor knows that if they wait, first of all, they may not get a manuscript that has a 10%, 15% problem in it through the committee, because somebody is going to focus on what's wrong with it. So that becomes a problem for a writer, right? So when it comes to making, a career, you can start out with a small press and work your way into a bigger press. But often what I'm seeing in terms of the amount of outside editorial work people are paying for is that the editors, especially the younger ones, but it's not just because they're younger, they're waiting for the perfect manuscript. And then everybody bids on it, and then it goes for a lot of money. But it's gotten to the point where I can send out a manuscript, and I used to be able to send it out to 3 or 4 of my top choices and then expand it, but nobody, unless multiple people want something, it's harder to sell it because people are afraid. And so if it doesn't work, their job is on the line. If too many books don't work, they're afraid that in the next merger, they're out of a job. So they're more cautious. So they're going to buy something that they know other people want. So if it doesn't work, they can say, gosh, but so-and-so, they all wanted it, and I don't know what happened, but whatever. Right. So the protection is there if multiple people want it. But with the auctions, the price goes up. So that might be money that would be divided amongst 5 authors who would get a start. But now those 5 authors can go to smaller presses. But that's why I think it's good that they exist, because a lot of people are working at the smaller presses who are good people with a willingness to do what I did when I was young, which was work for $50 a week and think you're lucky to be in the game.
Well, this is beyond entertaining, informative, from your heart. This has just been wonderful. I'm looking at the time, and I have come armed with a list of questions. Many knew that I was going to be interviewing you.
Okay.
So it being 13 minutes after the hour, I'm going to read some of these questions and just answer what you feel like answering. Okay. What would your dream client be like?
My dream client, I just, it depends in a way on, I want somebody who learns from rejection and understands that this is a process, that being a creative person, you have to put in the time, and you have to work hard. Many people want to work hard, but they have a hard time, and they'll argue with you if you say, this character is not working or whatever, the pacing is wrong, you have to cut or something. So I want someone who's willing to listen. Now, I understand that writers have to protect themselves from their friends and from many people who might give them bad advice. So it's a tough situation. You have to get people that you trust. It's one of the reasons why writing groups are so good. If you have a writing group and people in the group are writing work that you admire, when they tell you that that character's got to go, you got to at least think about it, right? But if your mother says, I really don't like that person, that whatever, she pisses me off or something, you might want to listen to your mother about that too. But it may be that she's not the best person to be taking literary advice from. Maybe it reminds, unlike Jonathan's mother, maybe she thinks it's her.
I have another question for you. Have you ever rejected / dropped someone because they refused to accept edits and recommendations from their agent?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes. And it was someone who I'd sold a 2-book contract for, who turned in a manuscript that was way below par and a mess for the 2nd book. And I said, you know, this isn't, I'm not going to pass this on. This, you know, this isn't good enough, you know. And he said, why? They already paid me for it. It's a 2-book deal. You know, let them fix it, basically. And I said, that's not how it works. And we parted ways because I didn't want to get involved with someone who was so disrespectful to the work that everyone along the chain does in order for him to be published. And so most people, what's hard for a writer is when they get conflicting, and I see this all the time in the passes. I'll send out a manuscript to 5 editors, and 3 will just say, I don't love it. One will say, the backstory's got to go. The other one says the backstory is the best part of it. You know, how do you balance all of this input that you're getting and come out with a clear sense of direction? And so having long conversations, creative conversations about what's wrong and why it's not selling. I mean, I go out often, you know, I don't sell things that on the first round a lot of times. Usually, I used to, I was spoiled, you know, for years. It was, an editor, we had a relationship, I'd sell it, it would be published. That's great. Now it's, you know, harder to sell and there's more work to be done, close to perfect as possible. When I do sell something, I tell my authors that I want you to save. I'm going to try to get you, if I go to a major house, I want to get you enough money so you can afford to hire outside help, because you're going to need it. At some point, the publisher is going to be through with you and you're not through with the experience of having your book published.
Right.
So you need to have kind of like a war chest set aside. One of the things that we do as an agent is just tell them when we think that the publicity department is not going to do a good job, you have to hire your publicist far enough ahead to make a difference. Because if you
6
don't,
months, perhaps.
yeah, you got to know that you're in trouble. An agent can kind of help you figure it out. Sometimes it's not the publicity department's fault. Sometimes it's the world. The distractions of, you know, there were authors published on September 11th. You know, there are many periods that happen where people are not paying attention. I've worked with a lot of debut authors, and so I see this. I love to see somebody get a start. You know, I like to see a writer enter the game, and usually they're grateful to be a part of it. What happens over time? Well, some of them are just grateful always. Meg Clayton is one of my favorite authors to work with because she comes up with great ideas. We discuss perhaps maybe I've got 3 ideas. Which one do you think is the best? And then we go through it, and she works really hard. I mean, her book that came out in 2019 that has done very well is the World War II one called The Last Train to London. And I just read her new manuscript. And I started with her years ago with a book called The Wednesday Sisters, about a writing group. If your book groups haven't read The Wednesday Sisters, Meg Clayton's, it's a wonderful book about a group of women who support each other, set in California in the 60s. And that was her first book. And she was with another agent who wanted it to be more like Sex and the City. And it was not who she was at all. And the manuscript was rejected. The agent was giving her advice she didn't. And so she decided that she needed a change. And when she came to me, I saw what she was trying to do, and it wasn't what the other agent was seeing in the book. And we had a meeting of the minds. And so we worked on the manuscript and I sent it out and sold it to Valentine. And she was with Random House and now she's with Harper, and she's had a wonderful career. And she's an amazing person who's always grateful. In fact, every year on the anniversary of the day that I called her and said I would represent her, she calls me on that day. It's been 14 years now to say this is our anniversary.
How affirming for you.
That, I mean, that really helps get through
Yeah.
a lot of the bad times, is to have
Yeah.
a people like that.
That's such a lovely sentiment. Thank you for sharing that. Do previous lackluster book sales determine whether you will sign an author, especially during the time of COVID, when all authors are struggling?
No, I've done, Meg was, I've taken on authors like that. And I'll tell you, one of the things that was gratifying to me recently is an author who's now sort of very well regarded, best-selling. When she came to me, her sales had gone down. And it was another instance of not the right fit. I think maybe she was being pushed into a category she didn't feel comfortable in. And I took her on and reinvented, in a sense, I got her back in the game, right? And recently the publisher who now after 2 or 3 books that did poorly with the last publisher, I took her on and sold her books for less money to a better editor and a better publisher to get her started again. So she did 2 books, and now her 3rd book is going to be the lead book on a major list, and there's just all kinds of drum rolls around it, and it's all very exciting, and that is very gratifying because she's the part that is most gratifying for my client and for myself. But I was talking to the publisher the other day, and again, this is a major New York publisher, and she said to me, because I brought her back to a publishing house that she had originally been with, but she left to get more money someplace else. So there was some bad feelings, and I got them to take her back, right? And so they weren't sure they wanted to, whatever it was, but they did. And they see now that not only has it worked, that it's worked fabulously well. So the publisher told me just a week ago, she said that the success that we've had with your client has really changed our thinking about other writers, that we now see that we can remake a career.
Right. About how to orchestrate that career, even if it means temporarily leaving the
and she said they just signed another author who had the same problem, a bad track, but it was because of the success they were having with this author, this client of mine, that they felt encouraged to do that. So I think people are looking at.
And was she writing in the same genre with both publishing houses, or did she go elsewhere, write in a different genre, come back to the original place, same genre?
Well, she came back to the original place and changed gradually over the 3 books, changed, but not completely, but developed. Just she became a better writer too. I think that she would agree that she grew as a writer and had a better sense of whatever it was. It all worked out. But what makes me happy is that it didn't just work out for her, but it was able to demonstrate to a publisher that we can do this, and I think my experience working at Houghton Mifflin was good for me because we never participated in big auctions. Houghton Mifflin was a kind of a stuffy Boston-based house, and they did wonderful books, but they would never, ever overspend. And so we would make books. And so we would not spend a lot of money and make a book. And when you think about what that means, now the biggest story on that score, and I don't know what the advance was, but I'm sure it wasn't anything that's commensurate to the success. But Where the Crawdad Sings is on the bestseller list. It's the 121st week on the bestseller list. And that book was not like a major big auction bestseller, whatever it was. That was a book that the company worked with the author and made into a remarkable success. The book deserves all good things, but you need a team to be behind it.
Indeed. Well, I see that we have sadly 4 more minutes. And so I want to take it right back personally to you. Who is your favorite author
Who's my favorite author
of all times?
of all time? Um, books speak to you at different points. But anyway, at different times in your life, a book will speak to you. I thought Madame Bovary was unbelievable because it hit me at the right time. I've always liked the story about Flaubert is when he was dying, purportedly on his deathbed, he said, soon I shall be dead, but that whore Emma will live forever. And he was right. So that's another thing writers ought to remember is that when you do it well, my God, you achieve a sort of an immortality. And what better thing to do than to be a writer and to create people who will outlive you. So.
Indeed. And then I have to ask you, what do you think is the future of Southern fiction?
I love Southern fiction. I think the storytelling, there's something very special about the South.
I'm originally from Memphis.
I really, there's a lot of competition because there are a lot of writers. And my husband always says it's like the humidity of Beaufort sort of grows them, But and there are a lot of readers. And people are social and they have book clubs and their groups. These small groups are so powerful and so important in shaping, a response to a book, And so I like the fact that there are a lot of women have circles in the South more so than in other places,
That's very true. And that feeds in very neatly and very seamlessly into the idea of the Pulpwood Queens.
That's perfect.
And the way that we are a community and support each other with Kathy Murphy at the helm, of course, leading by example as with regard to how to be a decent human being. And then it trickles down. And the impact of the Pulpwood Queens, everybody being involved with it, it's just the gift that keeps on giving. And we hope to see you at the next in-person Pulpwood Queen event, whenever that is, whatever year it is.
Wherever it is. But, Kathy is a saint. I mean, she works harder than any person I've ever. I mean, she really does.
A wizard. And
yeah. No, I mean, honestly, and having brought this community together is an incredible accomplishment. And she does it again and again and again. She's a serial
growing. She keeps evolving and she keeps acquiring more people. And for those that fall off the planet, everybody comes along and replaces them. It's the most miraculous thing I've ever seen in my life. So thank you so much for coming today.
It's my pleasure.
And you, I want to say that I think you're quite possibly the easiest interviewee. You're just lovely and articulate and fascinating. And I believe that you covered everything that we wanted to know.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. But I appreciate being asked. And Kathy, love you very much. Thank you.
I love you more. And you've been a wonderful, wonderful friend and mentor. And your example has been something that I've, followed all these years. We may have lost touch a couple of times, but
you just like that I gave that I gave Gregory Peck your poem that you wrote about.
That's right. And the first question she ever asked me when she wanted to know who I was trying to get Pat Conroy to come to the bookstore I was working in. She said, "Who's your favorite author?" And I was just like, "Pat Conroy." And she goes, "Well, that's mine." And what's your favorite book? To Kill a Mockingbird. Well, that's mine. So I knew
we had a destiny.
We are on the same page. And with the Pat Conroy Literary Center, with everybody that's here today, we're all just going to continue to work together. And we would love to have you back and continue this conversation. And hopefully it will be even better
Thank you.
the next one. So we've got to move on. But
Thank you.
Thank you.
Marly, the smile you put on my face this afternoon will be etched upon it for weeks.
Oh, good.
You
Oh,
are better medicine for my heart than any other heart doctor who's ever worked on it. I just love you. Thank you so much.
you're a
Oh,
delight,
thanks
Joe.
very
Paul.
much.
You're a delight.
Thanks, Joe.
Okay, everybody. Now we're going to be going on to our next panel, which is a different Zoom, and I
Thank you,
pray to
Claire.
God this one works. So bye, Marly. If you want to
Bye-bye.
stick around, Claire, stick around, but we got to go into the next Zoom meeting. So we'll see you there. Love you.